Hello, everyone. So today we're going to talk about one of the biggest composers out there that has ever existed in the modernist era. So my name is Faolan Smith. I'm a SFA music education major, and this is...
Hey, I'm Dr. Kaatz. I am the Assistant Director of Bands at Stephen F. Austin State University.
Yes, and today we're going to be talking about one of the big composers out there who ever existed during World War I, that is Gustav Holst, and some of his amazing music and his lifestyle he dealt with. But let's talk about Holst's early life when he first was born and started writing.
Yeah, so Holst is English composer, obviously. He was born over in England. He was born into a musical family. He was born in 1874, so the tail end of the 1800s, so the Romantic era's conclusion, if you will. And his mother was a singer and an organist, and his father was a concert pianist and organist, and he had an aunt, Nina, who was also a pianist. So Holst he grew up in a very musical home. He eventually took up playing the trombone and the piano and the organ, so he played a lot of different instruments. But something that kind of plagued Holst throughout his whole life is he had poor health. So he actually had to stop playing the trombone at one point because of his health. But it's interesting to note that he was a trombone player because that, I think, shows up in the way that he orchestrated things in a lot of his orchestral and band music.
So what health conditions did Holst have?
I don't know a tremendous amount about the details, but I know that he had a lot of weakness as a child. And that was something that kind of plagued him for a lot of his life. And I believe he had some issues. His eyesight was poor. He needed to have glasses. He had asthma, which made it really difficult for him to do a lot of cardiovascular stuff, which is part of the reason why he had to stop playing trombone. He had to rest while climbing stairs. So he couldn't be particularly physically active for a lot of his life, and it was a kind of a limitation on what he could do.
And that must have been insane. Like I have poor eyesight myself, and it's crazy knowing like these conditions. They can be really crazy. And it's speculated that Holst did the trombone and may have helped him with relieving his asthma a little bit, but he also had to quit playing piano because he had a hand injury.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So it's interesting. I don't know this for sure, but I wonder if Holst kind of used composition as a way for him to access musical expression because it was difficult for him to play instruments due to his health conditions.
And also with his family. His mother, whose name is Clara, she died at he was 8 years old, and his Aunt Nina began really getting him into composition. She was a pianist. His father remarried, and his stepmother was identifying as a psychic medium. She believed in like immortality and reincarnation. You hear them talking all the time about that sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that likely had an influence over Holst's interest in astrology, which shows up later in his compositions. I mean, I think we're gonna talk about the planets in a little bit, but a lot of that is based on astrology. That's sort of where some of the genesis of that piece.
Yeah, and at age 12, he actually started writing his first compositions. He was based it on a poem called Horatius he heard, as well as what his stepmother was saying. Berlioz is also a huge inspiration because he read a book about Berlioz. Then that's when he began writing some of his first pieces.
I think something that's really notable about not necessarily his upbringing, but his kind of formative years, is he ended up going to the Royal College of Music in England. For his studies to be a professional musician. A really important friendship that he made there was with Ralph Vaughan Williams, and the two of them kind of became ringleaders in this English folk song revival that started happening in the early 20th century in England, and a lot of that showed up in especially their band works, and that was sort of the genesis of some of the really great first wind band pieces for the concert band and in the context of which we think of a concert band nowadays.
And at the Royal College of Music, him and Ralph, they basically sat together for a lot of their classes, and then they both started collaborating with each other. After Holst graduated, he moved to Hammersmith, which is he was even trying to find a job. Finding jobs for composers at that time, it wasn't easy. There was no...
Still isn't easy.
No, it's not. You got to go for publishers and hope someone takes your piece. and even hope someone buys it. So it's not easy. Not easy now. It was nowhere near as easy even back then. It was worse back then.
Yeah.
Because Holst attempted to write other music. He attempted to write the symphony, the Kaatz Waltz, around 1900, and he thought that'd be successful, but it wasn't. Well, kind of is now, but back then it was not. So, and he also married his wife Imogen Holst, his wife, and had their daughter Imogen. So,
Yep.
And he was still trying to composing. He actually was a concert performer. He did perform with opera and in other orchestras. He even conducted. He wasn't sure what to do. He didn't have a job. He was trying to make ends meet because it was hard. And that particular area of England, it's kind of like not easy to get, money. Then he also decided he got offered a job at the St. Paul's School for Girls, which was a all-girls school in Hammersmith. He was asked to be the music director.
Yeah, and that was a pretty big event in Holst's life. There's several pieces that he wrote dedicated to or strongly influenced by his job at the St. Paul's Girls' School. And that shows up. He has the St. Paul Suite, which I think we're going to talk about. One of probably his biggest wind band work, Hammersmith, is written about the town of Hammersmith where he lived when he was teaching at St. Paul's. And I think one of the things that I really like about Holst is that he was an educator in addition to a composer. So I kind of like that when I get to do his music. I feel sort of like I'm collaborating with a fellow music teacher, even though we never shared time on the planet. It's kind of fun knowing that he was really invested in music education in addition to musical composition.
And then something really big also started happening in England around 1907, which was when the English started doing the English folk song Bible. Because World War I was about to start. It was tensions within the countries were still building. And I know back in 9/11, after 9/11, everyone in the United States started being more patriotic. And that's kind of like what they were doing over there. They weren't at war yet, but they were starting to find these old folk songs and starting to really integrate them into more modern society. Like, one of the pieces he wrote multiple pieces based on these folk songs, and Faolan Williams did too. And these folk songs really influenced him. So let's talk. So some of these pieces. Let's talk about some of them.
Okay.
His first big successful composition that incorporated these folk songs was he's called the Somerset Rhapsody for orchestra. He based it on folk songs from the Somerset region of England. The Faolan Williams folk song suite, folk song from Somerset. That the suite is based on movements from that song, from that area. Songs based on from that area, and Holst wrote the Somerset Rhapsody is written way before that piece was. Holst really took a lot of the folk songs from the Somerset region and started incorporating them in an orchestral setting. And there is a wind band transcription of it out there, but it's not in the original keys of the orchestra. But he took these. I don't remember the exact name of the songs, but he took like 4 or 5 of them. Basically, wrote them in this orchestral piece showing these songs in this area.
Yeah, and that was a pretty common thing for composers in the 20th century if they would base works on folk songs. A lot of times they would set the melody exactly or nearly exactly, and then they would surround it with accompaniment. I think in the wind band repertoire, probably the most famous example of folk songs used as the generative material for a piece would be A Lincolnshire Posy by Percy Grainger, which is based on English folk songs. Even though Grainger was an Australian composer, he was born in Australia in the late 1800s, and then he came over. He spent some time in England. He collected folk songs and sort of participated in this English folk song revival, even though he wasn't an English composer. And then he eventually immigrated to the United States, and he lived the rest of his years out in the U.S. And Lincolnshire Posy largely became popular. It was written in the late 30s. It was written while he was in the States. But I think a lot of Grainger's success happened after he got to compositional success, happened really largely in the band world after he had gotten to the U.S. But that's a different composer for a different podcast. But you can look at, and I think, I don't know of sources that directly trace this, although that doesn't mean that they're not out there. I would guess that Grainger, who's held up as one of the most important wind band composers in the 20th century, was probably strongly influenced, or at least influenced in some part, by Faolan Williams and or Gustav Holst's use of folk songs to write for military band in the very early 1900s.
Right, and another really big military band piece written at the time was Gustav Holst's First Suite in E-flat. One of the most notable pieces and most well-performed. In fact, it was actually played here twice. I know you conducted one of the piece movements of it, Dr. Kaatz?
Yeah, so the Holst's First Suite, a lot of times when I encounter young band enthusiasts who are, wanting to be band directors or studying, in music education, or maybe they're just first, second, third year band directors, and they're like, I want some repertoire to study to help me really understand a wind band. The three pieces that I recommend to people are Gustav Holst's First Suite in E-flat, Percy Granger's Lincolnshire Posy, and then one of Mozart's Wind Serenades, because I think all three of those are important pivotal pieces in our repertoire. But I would argue that the Holst's First Suite has maybe had more influence over modern writing in the last 100 years of wind band music than maybe any other single piece. And that piece, part of the reason is because the wind band, until the early 1900s, kind of only existed. In Mozart's era, there was this thing called harmony music. So in the classical period, and especially in Vienna, you would have these small, little wind ensembles of 8 to 10 or so players that would be hired by courts for entertainment purposes. But the band, in terms of what we think of it in America as the concert band, it didn't really exist until military bands started popping up in the 1800s and things like that. And Holst wrote music for military bands, and he was one of the first major composers in the Western art music canon to write a originally composed piece for band that was of a serious nature. So we had, Sousa was composing marches, and we had lots of marches going on in the early 1900s, late 1800s in the States. But a lot of music that would be performed by those ensembles were opera transcriptions. So Holst was one of the first people who was a major prolific composer in kind of the Western art music canon to write an originally composed piece for band. And Faolan, you just tell me, because I'm happy to dive into some details about that piece. You just let me know how far we want to go.
Well, yeah, we're definitely going to dive into it. It's a piece that's really known, and I'm a euphoniumist myself. And as you know, when the First Moon has that euphonium and tuba opening, even out in the First Moon with the chaconne, the melody is it's really folk-like. A lot of people contribute to the Agincourt folk song, but it's speculated that it's not because it's Holst's original melody. Because they listened to Agincourt and they couldn't really find any significance to it, but they did notice there are some moments in the piece where it sounds like that. That could be simply just due to the intervallic nature when the instruments are playing. So let's talk about the chaconne a little bit. That's the first move from the suite. What exactly is a chaconne?
So there's a lot of anybody who has studied the Holst's First Suite in any level of detail has probably wandered down the path of researching what a chaconne is. And really the short answer is that there's not a unified definition throughout history of what specifically a chaconne is. In general, a chaconne is a ground bass form. So it's a flavor of theme and variations. So a ground bass, meaning that you have this bass line that is grounded or stays in the piece, is audibly heard throughout the entire movement, or whole piece if it's a standalone chaconne. Those chaconnes are typically a one movement of a multi-movement piece. And there's a lot of debate among scholars about, there's a very similar form to a chaconne called a passacaglia. And both of these were forms that ended up becoming popularized in the Baroque period. But if you do enough research, you'll come to find out that the particular definition of a chaconne and a passacaglia are oftentimes conflicting, and it's hard to differentiate what one is over the other. An article I read recently was talking about how the chaconne in the first suite of Holst is probably more accurately a passacaglia if you go by textbook definitions. But anyway, so we're getting off on a tangent here. But a chaconne, in a nutshell, it's a type of theme and variations. So you have this bass line that's presented, and then the bass line will be repeated multiple times. And during the iterations of the bass line, the repeated iterations, you'll have new musical material that's added on top. Now, typically speaking, if you go by the textbook definition of a chaconne, the chaconne theme, so whatever that intervallic pattern is, will stay in the bass voices, so in the bottom voices the entire time. In Holst's chaconne, in the first suite in E flat, that chaconne is actually moved around to different parts of the ensemble, and he actually manipulates the chaconne theme. So it's a set of, this particular chaconne is a set of 16 iterations of the theme, or statements, if you will. And it's the, if I'm remembering correctly, it's the 10th statement. He actually inverts the intervallic pattern. So he keeps the same intervals, but he flips the direction. And so the chaconne theme gets flipped upside down. So while the chaconne theme at the start of the piece would imply a key center of E flat major, when you flip it over in the middle, it implies a key signature of C minor, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting thing. Like I listen to the piece all the time, and I've even seen the score for it. It's a pretty amazing how it's written, especially with some of the transcriptions that have been done with this piece. There are transcriptions of it for orchestra. There are like build-a-band transcriptions of it. It's that popular. And believe it or not, the other two movements, the intermezzo and the march, but the march in particular is also very famous. Holst took this theme and kind of like developed it throughout the piece.
Yeah, so the notable thing, I think Holst wrote 2 suites for concert band, or military band, technically speaking, is what he called it. So he has his first suite in E flat, and then he has his second suite in F, which the SFA bands are doing this year. The Wind Symphony is performing this year, and then they're doing that at the Conducting Symposium. And our conducting class, they rotate through the 3 English suites for their kind of final project for their second semester. But so they're getting to study that this year. The second suite in F is based entirely on folk songs. So it's very similar to Ralph Vaughan Williams' folk song suite. And I think Ralph's folk song suite came later than, it did come later and was pretty heavily influenced by Holst's both suites, but especially the second suite. The first suite is all originally composed music. And the really cool thing about it is that Holst crafts these 3 very contrasting movements. You have this really cool chaconne, and then this upbeat, really pretty intermezzo, and then this kind of fun, bombastic march at the end. But the opening interval pattern, this da-da-da, motive that you have in the chaconne theme in the first movement, that interval pattern is present in the beginning of every single theme, major theme, in the whole piece. So in the intermezzo, all of the themes in the intermezzo use that interval pattern in some way. And then all of the main themes in the march also use that interval pattern. So this is something in music that we call being cyclical, where you have this element that unifies all of the movements. So for me, that's what really separates the first suite out from the second suite, that it's all originally composed music and it's cyclically unified because of the motive presented at the very onset of the piece.
And both pieces are amazing. I listen to both all the time. And another big piece that by Gustav Holst that I love is, I think we all love, is The Planets.
Yes, yeah, that's arguably the piece that Holst is most well known for. And probably the most famous movement of that, I would say, is the Mars movement. And then secondarily would maybe be the Jupiter movement, especially the chorale in the middle.
Very famous. Da, 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 da.
Yep.
That's a little bit of it if you haven't heard it before. Cause like it's one of those pieces like that you've heard, but you may not recognize and know what it's called. There's a lot of classical music like that. But some things of The Planets that's really interesting is he didn't write the movements in order. He wrote Mars first, then he wrote Venus, then he wrote Jupiter, then he wrote Saturn, then he wrote Uranus, then he wrote Neptune, then he ended with Mercury. And it kind of ending with Mercury, it kind of speculated that it kind of has to do with Holst's zodiac sign. Because he was obsessed with horoscopy because of his stepmother. He would research it all the time. When he was writing The Planets, he attempted to base it off of the actual gods. Not just the planet itself, but the gods the planet's named after. And we speculate why he saved Mercury for last is because he's a Virgo. He was born in Virgo season.
Gotcha.
And also the movements were not, and also Mars was actually not written in response to World War I. Because World War I was at its height. A lot of people think, oh, it was Mars written as World War I, the aggressive military march with that ostinato. No. He just wrote it because he was basing it off the Roman god Mars and how, because he is a Roman god of war, and war was pretty common during that age with the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and there's some people speculate that John Williams, arguably the most famous film composer of all time, does some, to put it tactfully, borrowing from a lot of the great classical composers. And one of Williams' most famous themes, the Imperial March for Darth Vader's leitmotif, if you will, from the Star Wars saga, is a lot of people can draw some real strong similarities between that and the dum-dum-dum-dum-dum-dum ostinato from the Mars movement of the planets. So every time that I hear Mars, I kind of think of Darth Vader in addition to the Roman god of war. Fun fact, too, that's like the 20th century was where a lot of composers started to be really experimental about using multimeter, and harmony had broken, like the conceptions of harmony standardized in the classical era broke down quite a bit in the Romantic era, and there was a lot of chromaticism added into what composers were doing. But the 20th century kind of took that to the nth degree, and so Holst used a lot of colorful harmony. He occasionally would use some symmetrical chords like whole tone stuff, which is really cool. But the use of 5/4 was not a very common thing until the 20th century. So him using that in the Mars movement is pretty emblematic of some practices that were standard at that time.
And believe it or not, the entire movement's in 5/4 for Ralph. Those who don't know, 5/4 is a time signature or a meter. It's very uncommon you see that. But Mars, the whole thing, except for like the very end, that's in 5/4. It's pretty fun to conduct.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool piece.
And another really amazing thing with the planets is the orchestra size. The orchestra he required was massive. He required some really unique instruments at the time. Like, he started using aside from St. Saëns' suite for organ symphony, Holst also started using organ in the orchestra as well with Mars. You can't really hear it because it's like so loud.
Well, it depends on the group. Because if you get a real Whalen organ, if you have a good organ, you can hear it. But yeah, it depends on the recording, of course.
And he also asked for other instruments. Like, he needed like a lot of flutes, and he even needed one of them doubling alto flute, which is a very uncommon flute even today. He also needed one of the oboes on bass oboe. And he also
which is a pretty eclectic instrument even in modern times.
And he also did something even really cool. I'm a euphoniumist personally, and Holst actually started using the tenor tuba, that's what they called the euphonium back then, in the planets. There's a really famous solo for it in Mars, and I love it. I play it every now and then. It's not hard solo, and it's fun.
Yeah. That's great.
So another amazing thing with the planets is in Neptune, which is the final movement. In the movement, there are two antiphonial girls' choirs out there. They're singing. You can't see them because they're supposed to mimic the planet and the sea and how beautiful it can be. But he actually wrote it for the St. Paul's School for Girls, for the two girls' choruses that were there.
Yeah, because that was a big part of what Holst was doing at St. Paul's School for Girls. Sorry, those titles sometimes get swapped around. He was primarily teaching choral music, and so that was a big part of his responsibilities there. So Holst has a great deal of choral music also. And that was fairly common for composers back then to do a mixture of instrumental and choral music. We get a little bit less of that nowadays. It's like usually composers tend to track themselves into being an expert at composing one type of music. But that was a little bit more common back in the day.
Well, I know Eric Whitacre composes a lot of stuff now.
Yeah, I mean, Eric Whitacre is like a really well-known choral composer, but he has dabbled in band and done some stuff there, and he's done some orchestral stuff. But he is iconically known for his really lush, tight vocal harmony.
So the piece that Holst wrote for the St. Paul's School for Girls, well, it's only two pieces. This is two pieces for a string orchestra. One's they're both sometimes referred to as a suite in C, but they both have two, because they're both in C, but they both have two different names. One of them is written later in his life, one of them is written earlier. The first really well-known one is the St. Paul's Suite for string orchestra. It's a mean, I never played it because it's like way out of my comfort zone back in the day. My high school orchestra played the finale of it, and believe it or not, it's actually based on the Second Suite for Band finale. It basically is, but it's transcribed for orchestra.
Yeah, the finale from the Second Suite in F by Holst is my favorite movement of that piece because he uses the Dargeson, this really well-known folk song, the da-deen, da-don, da-deen, da-dee, da-deen, da-don. Sounds kind of like a Christmas song. It's great. But then he layers over that an extremely well-known English folk song. So that's kind of going in 6/8 at a decent brisk pace, and is a lot of fun. And then he layers in the middle of it. He layers on Greensleeves, which is, What Child Is This? Maybe some of you know that better as the Christmas tune, but it's the same melody. And so there's this really cool moment where instead of it being like a boom, 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 boom kind of feeling, it goes into this full bar feeling of being in 3. So you get this really lovely melody layered on top of this really active ostinato. Orchestrational effect that became emblematic of David Maslenko, one of the more prominent wind band composers of the late 20th century, early 21st century. And I wonder if there's a connection there. So maybe there is. I don't know.
It's a great piece. But you're not the other movements in the suite. The first movement in the St. Paul suite's a jig. It's based on this recurring ostinato. And as the moments in it where it goes like slow and fast, really that movement's really a rondo because the theme comes up like multiple times. Second movement is actually an ostinato, and it's a more of a fast one. It's a very fast movement, and the third movement is a slower movement, which is like slower and reflective. Then it goes, and it's this fourth fantasia on the Dargeson. They call it the Dargeson in the suite though, because it's a different key, and there are some variations to it compared to the orchestra version. There are some stuff he added in, a couple really different things. Plus in a different key, so it kind of sounds way different than the band version. And the orchestration is a lot smaller, though, and there's no percussion providing those amazing effects. Yeah. For the musical laymen and women in the audience, a ostinato is just a repeating rhythmic pattern, and that was a technique that Holst used quite frequently in his music. I mean, you look at all of his band music, but especially his suites, almost all of those movements use for the majority, if not the entirety of the movement, some level of ostinato. I mean, the chaconne, you could argue that the ground bass theme, the chaconne in the first suite, you could argue that ground bass is a form of ostinato. So Holst really liked to use that in his music. It was a favorite technique of his. Another big ostinatos, the Mars ostinato. Yep. Yeah, the dun, 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 dun. Yep. Another really big suite he also wrote for the St. Paul School for Girls, because they had 2 orchestras, and one was more advanced than the other, because later in his life, that's when he wrote this piece. He wasn't until a few weeks before he died when he wrote the Brook Green Suite. So the Brook Green Suite is also in C, and it's something that's easier because it's 3 movements, and the movements are it's half the length of the St. Paul Suite. It's only 6 minutes. The St. Paul Suite is 12, but the movements are in the similar styles. The first movement is a beautiful prelude, which is very light and airy. The second movement is this air, which is also slower and more somber compared to the prelude. Because despite the prelude's tempo, it's really supposed to be really light and connected. The third movement of the St. Paul Suite, the Brook Green Suite, it's labeled dance. But compared to the St. Paul Suite and the Brook Green Suite, it's also a jig, which is in C. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that really amazing fast movement, that 6/8 dance. And they're both pretty famous. The Brook Green Suite jig and the whole St. Paul Suite finale is both famous, just as the other pieces are. So Holst also wrote a lot of stuff for the St. Paul School for Girls. He actually had a soundproof room he had built. I didn't know that. That's pretty cool. Yeah, he actually had a soundproof room. He would go in there, and he would shut the door, and he just composed while he was in there. Oh, that's pretty cool. That's where a lot of his pieces were composed at, was the St. Paul School for Girls. It was composed for them. And it was amazing what he did. He got offered multiple tenures, and he even went to Harvard for some time at the end of his life to do a tenure there. Yeah, he lectured in the States a few times. There was, I think it was in the 20s sometime, he came and did some lectures at Michigan. But yeah, during the first half of 1932, he lectured at Harvard for 6 months, and he was doing a lot of conducting and stuff while he was out there also.
But that was at the very end of his life, and he was starting to get pretty sick and frail at that point.
Yeah, he also had a pretty humiliating problem going on. He had a stomach ulcer, which was causing him a lot of problems.
Yeah. Yeah, he passed away in 34, and in 1933, he met with his doctor, and the doctors were saying, okay, well, we can, you're not in a good situation right now, so you have two options here. You can do this minor operation that's going to really restrict your quality of life, or we can do this riskier major operation, and you can get some freedom from that. And he chose to do the later operation, but he died a couple days after he had the operation. So it was
due to congestive heart failure. A lot of people think it was speculated by what the operation did. Plus, prior to he had this operation, he did write some of his final pieces for the St. Paul School for Girls. That was the Brook Green Suite. He wrote he even conducted the premieres and some other stuff. And he did all this composing for them. And after his death, I can imagine how those girls are feeling, because he was the director with them for almost 30 years.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to imagine. He was such a well-known. Not all famous composers in the Western art music canon were well-known in their day, but Holst definitely was. He gained notoriety during his lifetime, and I think that would be really hard for that school. That this really world famous composer. I mean, he was well known in the States and all that stuff, so you could argue he was world famous, or as much as you could be during that period of time. He was well known in Europe, well known in the States, and he, kind of his home, his big gig, steady gig, was teaching at St. Paul's, and so I imagine that the students and the faculty and the community there was probably heartbroken after he passed away.
Right, and after his death, his funeral was really big. Ray Vaughan Williams, who is arguably his best friend, he conducted some of his own music and Holst's music at his funeral in tribute to both their friendship and each other.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. But yeah, he left a really great legacy, and for band folks in particular, we kind of hold up the Holst First Suite as one of the great masterworks of our repertoire. And in the 40s and the 50s, the mid-20th century, when the College Band Directors National Association was kind of on this mission to commission a lot more repertoire from major living composers, oftentimes the Holst First Suite was one of the handful of pieces that was cited as here's an example of what a band can do, and an effective composition for a band, because up to kind of the mid-20th century, the mid-1900s, there weren't a lot of originally composed, high-quality, serious pieces of music for the wind ensemble or concert band or whatever label you would like to use for that medium.
As well as for the orchestra, because the Planets was also getting very popular, it still is now, and it was amazing how he did that. So one thing with the Holst First Suite is one of the composers he had influence on really wasn't a composer, was a conductor and arranger. He also composed, was Colin Matthews. And he actually arranged, and he brought the arrangement of the First Suite you guys did.
Well, so to be more technical, Colin Matthews did the addition. So Colin Matthews did a lot of research looking back at Holst's original parts and manuscripts. So it's interesting, in the last few decades, we've gotten pretty sophisticated notation software, so it's pretty easy to, when you're using Finale is what I've used. I know a lot of my composer friends use a thing called Dorico, but it's easy enough on Finale. You type all the, you notate all the stuff in the software, and then you click a couple of buttons, and it automatically generates all the parts. Well, previous to that, what's been done for thousands of years, or at least hundreds of years throughout music history, is that composers will write everything by hand, and sometimes they'll write a full score, and then they will give the full score to a copyist, and then somebody will copy the parts. So they would go through the whole score and look at the flute part, and they would copy the flute part onto a separate page, and they would create the flute part by hand. Other times it will be a thing called a condensed score, where the composer might have 3 or 4 staves that they're writing all the material on, and they might write some notes okay, this line right here needs to go to these instruments, this line right here needs to go to this instrument. Frederick Fennell, really famous wind band conductor in the mid 20th century, He is the one primarily responsible for doing a lot of the work to look at the manuscripts and parts and all of these sorts of early copies of A Lincolnshire Posy by Percy Grainger and compile all of that stuff. So Colin Matthews kind of went on a similar mission with the Holst first and second suites and created the critical editions of those.
Right. Another thing Colin Matthews is known for is when the Holst wrote the planets, the planet Pluto wasn't discovered yet, and there's speculation Holst probably would have wrote a movement about it if it was. So Colin Matthews did, and he wrote a movement called Pluto the Renewer. It's an unofficial 10th movement from the planet. So not 10th movement, 10th planet that was written on. So the planet's unofficial 8th movement. You couldn't write a movement for Earth because Earth is not a Roman god.
Yeah.
And...
Right.
And Ralph Vaughan Williams also took a lot of time with him, and as well as Percy Grainger. All these composers were still writing and music based on Gustav Holst. And Holst really influenced these people. And even composers now are still doing it. It's like a lot of compositions have a rise. There's a piece I read on that actually wrote movements based on asteroids and the solar system. And there's even another piece I found that written about the moons of Jupiter. It's amazing how one composer and one piece can have this much impact and influence on so many other composers and so many other people.
Yeah, there's an interesting, even in the pop music world, Sufjan Stevens and collaborated with a few other people. I think I know Nico Muhly was on that album. I think Bryce Dessner might have been. That might have been a different album. Or that might have been a different collaboration or something. But they wrote a whole pop music album called The Planets, and it was kind of a callback to Holst's Planets suite. So that's even an example in popular music. Because I've found in my career that a lot of times there's sort of a divide between the art music community and the pop music community. But it's really cool to see when a composer of the art music community has enough weight in what they've done that it spills over into kind of the common vernacular and is influential in that arena. So that's really cool that Holst, even decades after his death, there are people in the pop music community writing music kind of calling back to ideas he had as a composer.
Yeah, I mean, it's been no doubt Holst is one of the most influential composers that was ever existed, and his music is still loved even now and still widely performed. I actually watched The Planets once, the Houston Symphony, and it's still popular. And I think we have all learned some pretty interesting things. I really appreciate you taking time to come out today after case and collaborate with this. And
thanks so much for the invitation. It's been a blast.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you guys. Thank you all very much, and hope you guys learned something new about Gustav Holst.